My name is Greg Ingram. I'm president of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I want to introduce the speakers today and the topic. Our speakers are Jim Follain and Seth Giertz. Jim is a person who has worked in the ivory tower and also in the marbled halls of Washington and has substantial scar tissue from both experiences.
That's right.
I think probably a bit wiser for it. He has done a lot of work in urban economics and in housing analysis. In addition to being an academic, he spent some time working for Fannie Mae and other housing agencies in Washington and some consulting firms looking at issues dealing with the housing market and the housing crisis. He was in the belly of the beast before the recession and has sort of lived through it and has been contemplating what he's learned from that subsequently. So he is a very experienced hand at this business, very knowledgeable about the data, and has sort of lived through the catastrophe at the policy level. Seth is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska. He has been working in the area of housing for quite some time. He's worked at CBO and at a presidential commission on tax reform, federal tax reform. So he's also been back and forth between the ivory and the marble in this business. So this is a very empirical paper. The title is on the board up here. I want to make a comment about this. I've looked at this paper. We've been talking about it. It's the first phase of at least a two-phase piece of analysis, and I want to share with you my takeaway from this paper, and which I find very interesting and happily surprising. But I want to start by saying one of the things that I have noticed professionally for a very long time. It's a bit of a cartoon about the urban economist on the one hand and the urban planner on the other hand. And the urban economist has a kind of view and predilection that involves looking across cities and looking for common elements in the urban experience. And so urban economists are taken and bewitched by the notion that there are a lot of similarities across cities. Urban planners are taken and bewitched by the notion that every city is different. And this notion that cities are very similar and every city is different has the paradox associated with it that both people are right, both professions are correct. And what's interesting about this paper, to me, is this paper in some sense embodies those results. And that is what you're going to see in the results are, there's a set of findings in here of remarkably similar, what I'll call behavioral coefficients across different categories of cities. He's done stratifications in different ways, and the behavioral aspects are very similar. At the same time, the fixed effects at the city level are dramatically different. So we have a result here where there's some underlying behavioral consistency across cities, but profound differences in housing markets across cities that show up in these fixed effects. The second phase of this research is essentially going to be to sort of winkle away at the fixed effects and try and introduce additional variables at the city level or at the metropolitan level to try and erode these, see if we can understand more about these fixed effects. But that's not what this paper is about. This paper is about the first set of results. The other remarkable thing about this paper, it's not remarkable, it's a sort of fact of life in some sense now, but for those of us who have been in this business for a while, what is remarkable about doing empirical research is how much data there are. So this is a paper that's looking at data from over 350 metropolitan areas in the United States, basically from the mid-70s to 1910. So what you have here is a really big panel data set. These results are using annual data, but it's essentially looking at housing market behavior over essentially a 30-year period in the U.S., culminating in the 2008 debacle. So it's a very data-intensive exercise. It takes a long view. It's a set of interesting and provocative results. So with that, to whet your interest and get you to raise your head from engaging in your lunch and pay attention to things, let me introduce Jim, who's going to do most of the speaking. Seth is going to answer all the hard questions.
It's a plan. Thank you, Greg.
Join me in welcoming Jim.
Thank you very much.
Good.
I started coming here as an assistant professor in the late 70s and just have some phenomenal professional experiences and friendships. Roy Ball, Dan Holland, Richard Bird, the list goes on and on and on. And just feel very fortunate to be able to work with Greg again. Okay, the title, a look at house price bubbles. 1980 to 2010, and then this the role of local market conditions. So we kind of snuck in a story that I'd like to try to tell to you today. Give you a sense of what we mean by bubbles, and this is a definition that constantly gets refined in different groups that I talk to, but essentially it's some sort of persistent, unsustainable departure of the level of prices, in this case housing, from what the fundamentals might suggest. So that's a generic definition. Then the argument is, what are the fundamentals? How do you measure that kind of stuff? But that, I think, is a pretty generic definition. And bubble detection is inherently difficult. I heard a story recently, what's the difference between economists and weathermen? Both are lousy predictors, but at least the day after it happened, the weathermen can agree on what happened. Economists are still trying to talk that through. And a part of this story that reflects on my life the last 10 plus years in Washington has to do with the difficulty of defining extreme events. I've done a lot of work on capital for banks and Freddie and Fannie and things of that sort. Stress scenarios, that's kind of the story. Defining what that stress scenario might be and then convincing people to take it seriously, very difficult. I've written something called Black Swan Blindness that talks about the complexity. It relates to a lot of arguments going on around the country today. Fracking, coal fracking in this part of the country. How risky is it really? And so it's not only hard to do, but then convincing folks that there's something really to worry about and what that extreme scenario might look like. They're very complicated conversations. Now, a big part of our story is that if you're going to look at house price bubbles in the United States, they didn't just start this time. We've had a number of them over the last 30 years, different places in the country. But I think what we want to leave you with is how important local market conditions are. And I'm going to give you a little more motivation to that in a second. And then pick up on a point that Greg raised about there's also this similarity that we find. And we found it surprising because we've done some previous work looking at one of the big explanations that people talk about for this most recent bubble is that there was a regime shift. The kind of equations that are estimated using data prior to the bubble look really different than now. And we found a lot of stability over time and among markets in some of these key coefficients. So it's kind of a dual. On the one hand, we're going to talk about the importance of local market conditions. On the other hand, recognize there's some stability here that I think ought to be taken seriously.